Robby Soave, what's on your radar today?
Can't wait to tell you. Well, on Sunday, President Biden made an important declaration, and one I've been waiting years for. He said this.
Mr. President, first Detroit Auto Show in 3 years.
Yeah.
Is the pandemic over?
The pandemic is over. We still have a problem with COVID. We're still doing a lot of work on it. But the pandemic is over. If you notice, no one's wearing masks. Everybody seems to be in pretty good shape. And so I think it's changing, and I think this is a perfect example of it.
Did you get that? The pandemic is over. That's the official word from the President of the United States. Biden acknowledged that COVID-19, it's not gone, might not ever go away, frankly. We'll still be dealing with it in some form, probably for years to come. But vaccines that drastically reduce the likelihood of severe disease and death are available for everybody who wants one. And we have booster shots for those who want extra protection, like the elderly and the immunocompromised, and really anyone else who wants to take that route. People who want to be even more cautious can wear KN95 masks, which scientists believe filter out the vast majority of pathogenic particles. Cumulatively, these disease prevention measures make COVID a far less pressing problem. Moreover, these measures can be implemented voluntarily. Yes, it's true that roughly 400 people who have COVID are unfortunately still dying every day in the U.S., but if you look at the age-adjusted risk, which is what this chart shows, you can see that vaccinated and boosted elderly Americans are having much better outcomes. This means you largely have control over your COVID fate. You can decide based on available evidence, or even a consultation with a doctor, what's right for you. It's your choice whether to get vaccinated, get a booster, or wear a mask. The public health rationale for the government to require various measures like vaccine passports, mask mandates, social distancing, lockdowns, school closures, etc., that has come to an end. It's great to hear Biden finally acknowledge it. But here's a question I have. If the pandemic is over, as Biden admits, then why is the federal government still operating with the emergency powers granted to it during a national crisis? So according to Reuters, the public health emergency, which was declared by former President Donald Trump in early 2020, it's still in effect, and the administration fully intends to renew it come October. The current plan is for the Department of Health and Human Services to let the emergency expire early next year, in January 2023. If Biden says the pandemic is over, well, then the emergency authority he has claimed for himself should already have come to an end. And that matters, by the way, because Biden has used his emergency authority in very significant ways. Most notably, recently, you may recall, he used it to forgive hundreds of billions of dollars in student loan debt. Yes, that action was actually undertaken in accordance with emergency COVID powers. Let me explain. In 2003, Congress passed the HEROES Act, which is an acronym for Higher Education Relief Opportunities for Students. The law, quote, permits the Secretary of Education to waive or modify federal student financial assistance program requirements to help students and their families or academic institutions affected by a war, other military operation, or national emergency. So the clear intention of the law, in my view, was to delay or modify student loan repayment plans for Americans who were serving in combat operations, not for anyone who just happened to have student loans in the middle of the pandemic. Now, even House Speaker Nancy Pelosi didn't think Biden had the authority to cancel student loan debt under that law. Quote, not everybody realizes that, but the president can only postpone, delay, but not forgive student loans, she said in June 2021. It would take an act of Congress, not an executive order, to cancel student loan debt. Pelosi obviously changed her tune subsequently. A few weeks ago, President Biden went ahead and canceled student loan debt anyway. His plan allows borrowers under a certain income threshold to have up to $20,000 forgiven. His plan also creates incentives for borrowers to move toward income-driven repayment, or IDR, which means that instead of paying back their loans, they would pay back a percentage of their income for a decade, which in most cases will be a far better deal for them than repaying the actual loan. I previously warned that unless the government also forbids universities to raise prices beyond a certain point, the likely outcome will be skyrocketing tuition rates because students will have more incentive to borrow heavily, and the educational institutions will be wholly unconstrained in terms of what they're charging. Taxpayers are footing the bill, not the students. In a recent report for the Brookings Institute, senior fellow Adam Looney found that the damage done by Biden's IDR program will essentially be catastrophic. He writes that, quote, there are several dimensions in which it is likely to have significant unanticipated negative effects. These include increased rates of borrowing and the fact that low quality, low value, low earning programs are essentially receiving a subsidy. He fears that, quote, with regards to overall college costs, institutions will have an incentive to create valueless programs and aggressively recruit students into those programs with promises they will be free under an IDR plan. This is bad, 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 bad. And to be clear, the legal justification for this was dubious and debatable to begin with. But now the justification doesn't exist at all. Biden admits the national emergency has passed. The pandemic is over. If it's over, he really, really doesn't have the authority to do this. And as National Review's Charles C.W. Cook noted in a recent piece, the Biden administration has already conceded that if it ever had such authority, that time is over. In May, the administration ceased using its Title 42 powers to expel immigrants based on COVID fears. In its memo announcing that the time for Title 42 powers had passed, the Department of Justice wrote, quote, the CDC has now determined in its expert opinion that continued reliance on this authority is no longer warranted in light of the current public health circumstances. If it was true in May, it's truer now. The only difference between the federal government's emergency Title 42 powers and its emergency student loan deferment powers is that Biden didn't really want to keep using the former, but he does want to keep using the latter. Sorry, doesn't work that way. The end of the COVID national emergency means it is now crystal clear the president cannot unilaterally forgive billions of dollars of student debt without an act of Congress. Now, I know, Brianna, you and I disagree on the underlying policy, but what do you think about my argument that if he's saying the pandemic is over and that was the justification being used, one I'm not frankly sure was legal in the first place, but what do you think about that?
So it was the subject of my radar last week, where, I had a Fordham law professor named Jed Sugarman on my show on Bad Faith Podcast to discuss this. And, the issue isn't whether or not he has the legal authority to cancel student debt. He absolutely does. It's the same legal authority that was used to postpone the debt payments by Donald Trump, and which is a moratorium that persists to this date. The question is whether or not he is choosing the right authority to use as a hook for his executive action. And what Jed and some other people have been arguing, potentially, it's true that Joe Biden intentionally chose the HEROES Act instead of the much more credible Higher Education Act of 1965, whose language is exactly on point and has nothing to do with national emergencies. It has to do with resolving education emergencies, which no one can dispute we exist in. With the skyrocketing costs of colleges, et cetera, as you described. And then the question is, did Joe Biden intentionally choose to use the HEROES Act over the Higher Education Act because he frankly doesn't want to cancel student debt? So whereas you are kind of framing this as, Joe Biden is trying to overreach his authority, I think that it's very likely that Joe Biden very well knows what he's doing, had no intention of actually canceling student debt for anybody. You kind of framed it as a policy that's already come to fruition. It absolutely has not. And we'll see if it actually does, or if it's just an inducement to get Democrats to the polls in the fall, while Biden still aligns with the corporatists that have lobbied him aggressively not to do full debt cancellation or even meet the full cancellation promises that he himself made during the course of the primary.
But won't the blowback, I see what you're saying, but won't the blowback for him if this is struck down or prevented by some court in some future, that he tried to do this, and won't that look so bad for him among people like yourself? Young people will just be furious.
People like myself.
I mean, you're not happy anyway, but you know what I mean.
But yeah, this is the point that Professor Sugarman was making, that this is something that could get struck down not just by the conservative justices, but this could be a unanimous decision potentially. And he points to Justice Kagan's in particular's administrative law decisions in the past. Apparently that is her wheelhouse of sorts, and says that this is something that if she is consistent in her rulings, she is very likely to strike down because Biden in the Department of Education just chose the wrong statute. Now, I do think, and what Judge Sugarman was arguing, is that they could simply change course. There's been no legal challenge at this point. The policy hasn't actually gone into an effect. And if there's enough social pressure on them, public pressure, for them to actually structure this in the right way, there's no reason why he has to hang this on COVID. But one last point I do also want to make about your radar is that I think one of the most problematic aspects of him declaring COVID is over. I think you're right about the calculation having shifted, given the less lethal nature of the virus, the more transmissible nature of this new variant, and all of these other kinds of things. But what gives me pause is whether or not declaring COVID is over will allow him to withdraw what social supports he has given to people who are struggling through this pandemic. So if COVID being over means no more mandates, fine, their mandates are already gone, but is it going to mean and we know this is true, no longer paying for vaccines, no longer paying for treatment. Kamala Harris, during the primary, made a big fuss of saying, how is it ethical for us to be going through this and having people going bankrupt because they get COVID? How we got to support people. Well, a lot of us on the left pointed out that logic extends to any number of diseases. How is it ethical that we live in a country where if someone gets cancer, they can go bankrupt, and whether or not they can get treatment depends on how much money they make? That seems absurd. And now we are shifting back into that dystopian world where even COVID treatment is going to fall cost-wise on individuals. And so I'm happy for him to declare whatever is over, use whatever language he likes, but is it going to be used as a pretext for the government to stop doing what it can to help people that are still suffering with this crisis?
What I hope by COVID is over, he means that we're done, or that the pandemic is over rather, that we're done treating COVID differently from other diseases or from other issues. It's this special issue that everything else gets put on hold. That's the main thing we have to tackle as a society, as a government, which has been the case for the last 3 years. So if we have the problems you're talking about, right, with just disease and how do we have to fix our medical system? COVID, like other things, needs to be addressed, but is not the special thing we hold all of.
I like to see everything else ratcheted up to COVID levels of care. Healthcare should be free, as I obviously think, not ratcheted down. But we'll have more rising for you after this.